I want to call up Amendment number 12, Hyde-Smith number 12. And what it does, the For the People Act requires states to permit sworn statements in lieu of showing voter ID at the polls. This effectively undermines all state voter ID laws that I worked very hard on in Mississippi. This amendment would do three specific things. Number one, it would amend the law so that any vote cast with a sworn statement instead of with the voter ID would be considered a provisional ballot. This is consistent with Mississippi law, where voters without ID can instead cast a provisional ballot. Number two is to add findings of the constitutionality of voter ID laws. And number three, add findings about public polling on the popularity of voter ID laws. Section 1903 of the For the People Act undermines the voter ID laws that are on the books in 36 states, in both Democrat and Republican states. It would effectively revoke all voter ID laws in the country by requiring states to accept a sworn written statement in lieu of voter ID at the polling place. This amendment would require any ballot cast without meeting state voter ID requirements to be considered the provisional. This would permit states like Mississippi to continue to enforce their voter ID laws, which have proven successful in preventing fraud and promoting the integrity of elections. Furthermore, this amendment would add important findings regarding voter ID, the constitutionality of that. The Supreme Court found in a 6-3 decision in 2008 in the case Crawford versus Marion County Election Board that voter ID is completely constitutional. Justice Stevens, who is considered a liberal on the court, said the voter ID laws are not discriminatory and that the laws help states promote their interest in deterring and detecting voter fraud. Voter ID has resounding public support. Polls consistently show broad majorities, including majorities of both political parties, support voter ID laws. A recent AP poll found that nearly 3/4 of all Americans support voter ID. Voter ID does not keep legal voters away from the poll, and virtually everyone of voting age already has an ID, and for those that do not, every state with an ID requirement issues a free ID to anyone who needs one. This is the law in the state of Mississippi, where our Secretary of State has not only helped anyone who needed to get an ID, but also helped coordinate rides and other assistance to ensure voter ID did not require any legal voter to stay away from the polls. And this data bears out. Voter ID doesn't impact voter turnout. Studies have shown that voter ID is adopted. Voter ID turnout does not decrease. Voter turnout does not decrease. In fact, Mississippi voter turnout has actually increased since we adopted voter ID. Voter ID is constitutional, popular, and doesn't hold any legal voter back from the polls. Instead, voter ID functions to ensure that nobody is voting illegally. And I ask the committee to support my amendment.